Kamila and I have been tasked with making these otherwise congenial people argue with each other. And the topic for today is, broadly speaking, what are the differences between deep neural networks and the brain, or neural networks, generally speaking, in the brain. And I'm going to basically just act as a referee, and Kamila is going to be in charge and ask the questions. So let's just dive right into it.
All right, so I think we've observed this deep neural networks advancement recently, and we've seen that in the talks before, that they can explain a lot of brain representations and tasks, but we know that they are not really like a brain, and they don't explain the full variance in the brain. So the question is, would making deep nets more brain-like actually improve the ability to explain the brain representations? And we need to define how brain differs from the deep net, and also which of these differences would matter. So for the sake of the starting the discussion, let's just first assume that the goal of the deep net is to explain the brain representations in the brain, a brain representation of object recognition, just so we have some kind of a goal to start with, and then we can talk more about other goals later on. So now I just mentioned briefly some of the ways that brains differ from deep net, just to initialize the discussion, and then of course I hope the panelists to add to this list. So there can be anatomical constraints. So for example, let's say number of neurons differs between the deep net and brains. There is also topography, receptive field sizes that are different in the center and periphery. We've seen the talk in the morning about that. Local recurrence, top-down and bypass connections, spiking neurons, different type of neurons, and also the learning rules are different. So in the brain, we have unsupervised relay-informant learning. The task, also, we should maybe make them more natural, and also we should make deep net generalized across the task, like the brain does. And also the training that the deep net have is also not very natural, because we need more natural stimuli to feed the environment. Maybe you should train on the brain and behavior representations. So this is just like the open the space of the differences. But I think my first question would be, which brain-inspired constraints seems to be most critical to implement in the deep net? So I open it to the panel. I don't know, maybe Nancy, you could start on this one.
Well, okay, since I know least about these things, I'll just mouth off, right? So it seems to me one of the things that we need to do is think about more clearly what the goal is. So as you said, the goal, we could start with the goal of understanding object recognition and in the ventral pathway, so that's nice and concrete. But there's lots of possible things we might do with a model, right? So the point of a model is not to duplicate every exact thing in the thing modeled, right? If that was the goal, you should, have a baby. Then you'd have an exact replica, right? But that wouldn't explain anything, right? So presumably you want to have some abstraction, some differences between the model and the thing it's modeling, so that we can, extract the essential characteristics. So I think there, from there, we should really think about what are the key things that we want to understand about ventral visual pathway, such that we know what we need to capture in the model. Yeah.
And for you, what would be these key things?
Well, I have my own agenda.
Yeah, that's good. That's what we want to know.
Okay, so being quite unconstrained by actual knowledge of deep nets, I can fantasize like wildly, and it seems to me that to me the biggest hope. Maybe we can all dispense of this right now, and that would be useful. But let me just toss out there some possible fantasies of what deep nets might be good for from my perspective, right? So for the last 20 years, I've been looking at the bottom surface of the brain, and there's all this structure in there, right? There are all these particular regions that have particular functional profiles. They're in particular locations, and it's more or less the same in every person. And so, the field has made a lot of progress understanding what those different bits respond to and characterizing some of the representations in there. But we have approximately zero understanding of why brains should be organized like that in the first place. Like, why is that a good way to organize a brain? Why should you have different patches on the bottom of the brain or in object recognition machinery that are very differentially responsive to different categories of stimuli? Why is that a good way to design a brain? And why those particular categories? And why in those particular locations? And all of that, right? So to me, if it were possible to find the conditions under which you could take a deep net, train it on a bunch of tasks, perhaps give it a few architectural constraints to start with, if you ended up with any of those properties in your deep net, that would be profound, right? That would be really, that would hold a lot of explanatory power, right? Like if it turns out that that's the structure you need to solve this problem, I think that would be very illuminating. So I don't know if that's a hopeless fantasy. I'm thinking about this thing that was in Nature a couple weeks ago with the grid cells. I don't know if everybody saw that, right? So very, very simply, they trained a deep net to do path integration. They built in place cells and head direction cells. It gets pretty good at path integration, and then you look inside, and lo and behold, it has grid cells. It
That's
invented
not
them.
why it has grid cells.
Okay, so tell us. Tell us.
No, I mean, I don't want to sidetrack this. But.
No. I mean,
Well,
It has grid cells because it was doing some kind of supervised dimensionality reduction of the place cells and the head direction cells. The path integration part is not really the thing that's explaining it.
there was an element
okay,
to
but
that.
that's still interesting. Yeah.
But I think it does raise, I think it raised an important point. I mean, a lot of discussion about, sort of training networks to solve particular problems. And I think, the one way in which brains, and, we sort of focus on human brains, maybe non-human primates or rodents, but there are brains everywhere. And, these brains, they don't all have the same kind of architecture, but they all solve a common problem. And then when you're thinking about the representational problem, and Andre actually brought this up in his talk, you have to think about how these representations are going to be used. So you don't create the representation and to solve a problem. Representations are formed in the context of how they're being used. And so if you take anything from the grid cell paper, it was essentially by training a network, just using an LSTM to train a very simple network, but putting it in the context of spatial navigation, and you find these representations that sort of solve the spatial, that are good for solving the spatial navigational problem. In the ventral stream, depending on how it's actually used, the use actually can define the constraints on the representation. There's certain features of the primate, sort of visual representations, which, all the structure columns and things which, rodents, fortunately, unfortunately for them, they don't have. And so so you can say, well, maybe they're just kind of lacking in something, but you could also think, well, maybe that's just not how they use their particular visual system. So, and this sort of brings us, I think, to the more fundamental issue, which is, what is it really difference between brains and artificial networks? Brains are actually formed, the representations are formed through actual experience, through interacting with the world. We sort of think about this as the learning problem, but this is not a trivial problem. It's like, you sort of, they discover the problems that need to be solved, and then the brain creates the solutions based on the nature of those interactions. Now there can be a lot of pre-processing that goes on, and and I think that's what a lot of the focus of. So Jim's got to jump in at some point, man. You got to.
Well, I'm just trying to be nice and let you keep.
But it's
Wait, Matt, I don't. Can I just clarify what exactly you're claiming here? Are you claiming that the brain is an end-to-end learning system? So.
Well, it is. It's. That's how it evolved. I mean, that's the problem that I had to solve.
If it was, but the end-to-end learning is happening during the development of the organism,
Well, that's
starting at birth.
I mean, there's a part of that. I mean, you can think of the sort of the evolutionary context in which sort of the niche defines some of the constraints. This is sort of a neuroethological. I mean, the neuroethological perspective is sort of the extreme of that. But you think this is just a general constraint. So until we actually have networks that are able to learn through actual experience, and this involves the kinds of things that Josh talks about, physics and movement and all the things that actually involve in combining action with state representations. That's what the brain does, and that's not what.
So you're saying current deep networks
do.
for visual recognition are not task focused enough, and they're not embodied and embedded enough in an interactive task context. I mean, I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, but I'm saying that the structures of the.
But
I think that's what you're saying.
That was helpful.
I think that's what you're saying. First of all, I want to sort of clarify that I'm going to argue with people because I was told to argue people.
Ooh, that's why they put you in the middle. All right.
So don't accuse me of not being nice. Okay. So because you guys were supposed to say at the beginning, but Matt, I think I agree with what you're saying, but you can't say that deep nets aren't optimized for a task. They're optimized for a particular task. You may not like that task, but let's at least use the language to say, okay, what would you change? In Kamila's language, you would say, change the task that those networks were optimized for into some grounded thing that you're imagining, and that's great. I would be sympathetic with that idea, but then I'd say, instead of just actually complaining about it. Someone has to go and do it, right?
So it's not a complaint. It's saying that's the difference, and that was one of the topics. This task.
Well, okay, so you think the next thing that should happen is somebody should build new tasks around. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. The question then might be which tasks and so forth, and maybe we don't even nobody.
Well, we could talk about that in the context. I mean, like, so Andre's work again is a good example of that, right? Like he's saying, let's enlarge the task of object recognition to include something that people can do that might give some insight into how they do all the things they do with object recognition, which is to recognize objects in, let's say, very unfamiliar poses. Right, I think that would be a good step. I'd say that's just the first step, but a good step. And I could suggest others, like, you know, for example, the ability to learn a new object category from one example. Right, I don't think that was on your list, but that's a part of the. We know it from the cognitive level that the brain has learning algorithms, and let's say even like learning to learn algorithms that can support that. And
I don't think we know that. Again, to be argumentative.
Let's argue that the brain has algorithms for that. Well, if
I think you
people
believe
do
that.
that,
I don't think we know that.
What are you talking about? Okay. I'm going to go find an object that you haven't seen before, and you're going to learn it. But it's going to take me a few minutes.
I don't think we have any of those here.
Well, that's
Wait,
true,
Jim,
this
are
is
you
your
objecting
department.
to the idea that we know what the neural learning algorithm is, or just that you're objecting to even the idea that people
I'm
do
objecting
learning to learn?
the simple statement that there's objects that we obviously haven't ever seen before, and therefore we obviously learn from one trial. I mean, deep nets show you, for instance, that you learn from a bunch of stuff that includes a lot of statistics, including statistics that are going to be found in anything that you're going to present to me, that you're going to call an object. And so it's never completely novel.
No.
And that is the power, that is the thing that's like, well, those things do get encapsulated in that without having to be built in ahead of time to say.
That's right.
But
But
you're
you
saying
can
a
teach-
lot of things. I'm not saying anything was built in ahead of
let's try to
time.
focus.
Right?
You could teach people 50 new objects they've never seen before, right? And then you could test them later with those 50 and another 50, and they could, if you did it right, they would remember which 50 they saw. Now, all of those 100 objects have similarities to the things you've seen in the rest of your life and build on those representations. Nonetheless, you can encode which of those things you actually saw before and which you didn't.
Yeah, but that's simple memory. That's an easy to solve problem.
Well, okay, so
The hard problem was representing this object in a way that would allow it to be
so let me just say,
stored
so
in memory.
Jim, there's a thing that we've argued about for a while, which is it possible that today's that just the same kind of thing you use to like train up a network for an ImageNet challenge will just, in the course of doing that, which does develop a really good like high-level feature space to solve this basically 1,000-way classification problem. Right? Like one way you can think of just an AlexNet type thing, basic ImageNet net, is you have lots and lots of layers, but really, except for the last one, which is just doing a 1,000-way, logistic regression classifier, is just learning a really, really good feature space. And you might say, well, if we just kind of scale that up, maybe that will be all we need to do one-shot learning of object categories. Yeah. So actually, Kelsey, is Kelsey here by any chance? So Kelsey Allen and working with an undergrad here, Sky Shin, had a really nice paper that they submitted to NIPS showing a lot of progress towards that. But they showed, in particular what they did was they showed that you could take like omniglot type problems or ImageNet type problems and build a kind of a lifelong episodic learner that would solve a whole bunch of little classification problems like this 5-way classification, this 10-way one, and build up a representation that did give you pretty good, I mean, not anything like human level, but pretty good transfer to new categories you haven't seen before. But it did a lot better than from a lot less data than from a sort of, let's say, a big, like an AlexNet type classifier. So the details of exactly how they did it, like they did it by putting on a kind of a lightweight non-parametric mixture model on top. So they kind of combined some of the things I've always liked, like a flexible non-parametric Bayesian. Like Sam's used these a lot in his memory models. They put that on top and to basically a deep metric learning thing, and they got them to learn together. For people who know about prototypical networks, it's kind of an extension of that with a layer of non-parametric Bayesian classifiers on top, and it does better. I mean, I think we would like this because it does better than many other approaches. It did really quite surprisingly well. It definitely did better than just trying to learn a deep feature hierarchy. But it also, was able to do things like see something that was from a totally new class and be able to tell, is this just a weird one of the many thousands of things I've seen before, or is this just a new thing I've never seen before? And it was that DP mixture, non-parametric mixture part that allowed it to do that. So that, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of it's like one nice small step on top of the thing you're talking about, but like it definitely motivates going to look for something like that in the brain. Or maybe what that would mean is looking for some interactions between like memory, the kind of memory areas that you guys have studied and which aren't that far downstream from the end of the ventral stream and the high-level ventral stream. But I think again, it wasn't motivated by neuroscience, but it was motivated by a human ability that cognitive scientists have shown, and then exploring a space of about almost 10 different deep network architectures and showing, hey, this is the unique one that actually gives us the best performance here and some extra abilities. And then I would say, let's go and see if we can find that kind of interaction in the brain. Right?
So let me just set everything you just said in a shorter version that Kamila set up the question is like, you have to have a goal, and you just implicitly define the goal as matching.
I'm saying let's add in a goal.
Well, okay, fine. So the goal for me is like a collection of sub-goals, but you added a sub-goal, which is like, now let's do this one-shot learning behavior, and I would agree with that goal. Probably everybody would. The more goals, the better.
Yeah.
And then the question she was asking us to say is, what do we need to take from the brain to then reach that sub-goal? And the answer I think you gave, if I could paraphrase, was you have in your head some ideas of what we should add, and you guys have been trying to add them and have some progress. She was asking us what other things, should we be adding than, hey, let's put some more smart Joshes on the problem.
Kelsey, this is Kelsey, not Josh.
Well, whoever did it, but like I think she's asking us to say, neuroscientists say, well, where is your,
Right, so
Matt
here that's coming from
Matt mentioned
cognition and behavior.
Well,
that's also part of neuroscience, right? Or do you mean specifically looking at
when you say
neurons?
cognition behavior, again, the part from cognition behavior was the test of humans that they can't do. You're saying they do better than the current models, which I think is a hard thing to actually explore and convince people of first, which is a hard problem.
That's
but
what
I'll accept that.
We used the wonderful resources of open mind and lots of simulations.
Well, okay, but I'll accept that for now without pushing on that. But so given that, that's the contribution from that side. Then the other contribution is you or others have ideas of what models should be built. But what she was asking us is like, ideas in people's heads aren't things from the brain. Like she's asking us to say, what do we know from brain science? Or if you want to say behavior, I would say that we should be including that aren't included. That was what she was trying to get us to debate.
But isn't that, I think Josh was trying, maybe he didn't phrase it in the way that would be familiar to you, but he's trying to make a point about episodic memory.
Yeah, exactly. So take one-shot learning
that's
behavior.
Brain PR. saying episodic memory is just words.
No, we took a model that Sam has published. Sam has published multiple papers
leave me out of
using
this,
these. No. I'm just saying you and Yael and others have suggested these kinds of non-parametric Bayesian models. You can point to some parts of the brain that do this sort of thing, right?
Again, brain stamp of approval.
Jim, don't caricature it. It's the point. Part of the exercise here is not just picking out particular facts about the brain and then latching those onto neural networks. Part of it is I think this is also what Matt was saying, is that identifying some computational principles, right? So it's not just saying episodic memory, blah, 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 brain. It's saying that episodic memory serves some particular computational function. All right, go, Gabriel.
Clearly, our existing, so first of all models are wrong, some models are useful, right? So clearly our computational models now do not encompass the whole brain, right? So eventually we want one day to have models that incorporate the hippocampus and motor cortex and, God forbid, the cerebellum too, I don't know. But the way to get there, I think, is we need concrete, specific questions and tasks. And I particularly like the history of physics, where we build we build models, and then we try to explain reality, and then we build better tasks in this jargon. And I think what would be particularly exciting here is to discuss which tasks we need to test now to break those models. I think that we can break these models. I think that there are lots of interesting ways in which we can break them. And then we can say, well, what do we need? Maybe what we really need is an episodic memory module instantiated by hippocampus interactions with inferior temporal. I don't know. But first we need to define clear, concrete tasks. Because otherwise it's, we can say, well, the model doesn't have somatostatin interneurons from prefrontal cortex. It certainly doesn't, but why do we need them, right?
It sounds like you're agreeing with Josh, right?
I'm saying we need concrete tasks that we can actually
grow.
That is a concrete task,
Just
right?
like Andre introduced one, which was like a much more invariant kind of notion of recognition, and I was introducing another one, which is like about one-shot learning and learning to do one-shot learning. But Jim, is the implicit context for this debate? And I'm just trying to think, because I hear you when you say you're supposed to be the critic, and I know some of the things you said. Is this? It's not. Your skepticism maybe isn't to cognitive scientists, but more like to neuroscientists who might say, hey, the study of actual brain machinery is going to help AI, and you're kind of saying, show me where that's actually going to work. Is that what you're
I'm
being
skeptical of both. I'm
Okay.
an equal skeptic, but I would agree with Gabriel. It's like the only way you resolve that is not
Yeah.
by debates of people talking their
Yeah.
particular points of view.
By
You
trying it,
resolve it by being concrete about your task and then trying. And I think you'd like to say you guys did, and
Yes,
I think
we did.
Josh, I think what would be very useful is to have a task and
Yeah,
say,
it's
well,
your task. We just added in 1,000 more categories.
I think it would be fantastic
Yeah.
if
It's basically, I mean, again, if you want to take on the task, I mean, I think the way you define the task of visual recognition is so incredibly limited that we've squeezed out most of the variants of it. Like, if you actually want to study, let's say, vision, let alone cognition, you're going to have to get beyond core object recognition.
I don't necessarily disagree.
But in that domain, we're actually making a little bit of progress towards learning to do one-shot learning in that core recognition.
I think it would be fantastic, and the way I think I don't necessarily disagree with this. I think that there are lots of tasks that we still have not solved, and
Like how
I think,
about-
and plenty of them. I think one-shot learning is a very interesting one.
You're right, stealing, right?
I personally think
actions.
I think stealing is fascinating. I think we're very far from understanding stealing. I think that's very complicated right now. But I think that there may be baby steps that we can go, and maybe one-shot learning should be included in the battery. Ultimately, I'd like to explain everything that humans can do in terms of vision, and I think that maybe one-shot learning is a very interesting task. I don't know about the specifics. Unfortunately, I haven't read the NEEPS paper. Maybe but I'd love to have a specific concrete task that we can all post to the community and have people try to solve them.
I mean, I would say, right now, in the
NIPS
NIPS community, there's a lot, maybe I would say this is a place where the neuroscientists should look to the machine learning community. There's a lot of great tasks, like these kind of one-shot learning things. I mean, we helped to introduce some of those, but a lot of other people are working on those problems, right? So I don't know, I think there's another problem that a lot of people work on in machine learning is what they sometimes call or the toy version of it is like this multi-MNIST one, where they like superimpose multiple MNIST characters. So like it's getting towards occlusion and clutter. And I know you guys are working on some of those things, but I think if we want to enlarge, I mean, it might be that to really address this question in a satisfying way, where we're not just debating over little things, we do need to take steps. Like let's get to more complex scenes, for example. Not to mention actually like relations between people, like stealing.
I think we need to spend more time doing that and less time advertising our own particular beliefs about how it should be. Right. That's
I mean, again,
so
this page, I wasn't trying to do that.
Vision, right?
This
So
quotes your
Caltech
books.
101 was the data set for vision. It was like, oh look, you can't do this. Like, and that set was completely, completely busted. It was like easily busted by even low-level models that could solve that, right? And then ImageNet came like, oh, that's a real challenge, and then that actually pushed the field, right? So we need analogies. So I would take the thing that you've done, right? I don't know exactly what was done, but it's probably of the scale of Caltech 101, which it can be attacked and solved in simple ways.
Yeah, but
So
hundreds of
coming
people
up-
have tried, and they've all failed so far. So let's
okay,
see
so
them.
That's a good sign, but then we have to standardize around those things.
Yeah,
And that's
well,
again
people
where I
are.
agree with Gabriel.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing, but each one is hard to do, and that's not what we're trained to do. We're not trained to come. These are kind of these are engineering forms of asking good questions. Matt and I were talking ahead about asking questions. This is like you have a question, like formalize it in a hard way that can then be tested by others. That's actually a hard activity. It's not the one we're usually rewarded for doing. We're rewarded for kind of solving questions, not
I
actually.
mean, neuroscientists, but
Right, yeah,
you
I
too,
think that is
right?
what computational. That's what we do in our group. It's a lot of what we do, actually. So
Where-
I'd
Define
like.
the question.
Where's
Yeah.
the
Yeah, try to
where's
define-
the download on those tasks that we can push models against? Like,
GitHub. I mean,
no. So do you advertise it as a task like ImageNet?
yes. We call it. We have the Omniglot challenge or the Frostbite challenge. Hundreds of people have worked on those tasks. I'm not trying to boast or whatever. I'm just saying I completely agree. That's what we do. That's our ideal. If ask any of my students here, we're always saying, okay, how can we turn this into the kind of task where we'll get a lot of people to work on it? I think I'm just violently agreeing. I'm not, but for some reason you decided to argue with me. So, but I mean, there's extra challenges of can you get to, systems neuroscience? Can we come up with tasks like this that you can get monkeys or rodents to do? And I mean, I do believe that's one of the reasons why one of the reasons we worked on the Omniglot thing, and actually Vindrick is trying to do that along with Xiaojing Wang and Brendan Lake. So, I think I'm all for that.
Some of the things that we
or
heard about
Andre's task
today
is another one.
that a lot of people here are working on are exactly that kind of example. That is, when you go beyond just an object and a location, right? It's nice to be able to identify an object, categorize it, and know where it is. But vision is so much more than that. And we know from lots of different lines of work that when you look out at a scene, you see not just objects and locations, you see all this other stuff, right? You see the the physical relations of the world, as Josh has been saying for a long time, but it's just true. Like when you see something that isn't, you see something that isn't stable, you don't have to like write down equations. You just like, empathize with it. It's imperiled, right? You just see it. Right? It feels like a part of perception. And similarly, when you see people socially interacting, you see an interaction. You don't just see two people and do a big, long, convoluted cognitive inference. You see an interaction. And, Layla Ishik can decode, from MEG data, a very complex real-world scene with two agents in it, you can decode whether those two agents are interacting with each other or not at 140 milliseconds after the stimulus comes on, invariant to the scenario, right? So I think there's a lot of apparently higher level things, which have been talked about many times today, from physical structure to social structure to actually navigational affordances and all kinds of other stuff, that are probably computed very fast and form really part of the percept of the world. So it's not ventral visual pathway per se, but I would say it's part of perception, and it's fast, and it's part of what we should aspire to explain. And stuff in Vince's lab is, we heard the two talks today. I don't know where Yulia and Carolina are. Yeah, hi. So those guys, are in a position to look at single unit responses in these very tasks. So I think those are great directions.
So I think that one thing though is that what would be the input to this task, right? So for object recognition, very easy. You just give for
Same with all these ones, right?
Like for the cochleogram in hearing. But like if you have a complex task that involves like agents or interacting, or like even this emotional responses or something like that, what would be the input to the model that you would actually train the model on? So that would be maybe interesting to hear your ideas about that. We really want to build more complex models or representations.
I don't totally get it.
I think I get it. I mean, you can say, like, if you're going to do something with intuitive physics where at some level the models have like object files in them, you need a way to compute those from images. So that's what Ilker is working on in his NIPS paper. Is Ilker here? Everybody's so hard at work writing more papers. I think there are a couple of different strategies that you can approach from a modeling side, and I'm kind of like you. I'm sort of saying, or maybe it's like, I don't know who it's like, but I'm looking. To me in my workflow, like cognition drives computation, which drives hypotheses and questions for the brain. So I mostly have hypotheses and questions for the brain, but I'd like to know something we've all wanted to know. How do object files work in the brain? Are there discrete slots, or how are they computed? How are they tracked over time? How are their physical properties extracted? Again, so Ilker and colleagues submitted a NIPS paper in which they tested out various models, including like symbolic particle filters and LSTM-based approximations to that, and they all do pretty well. It's hard to tell apart from the behavioral data, but at least the LSTM-based model, inspired by like your work with Dan, provides possibly testable hypotheses for how these things might be encoded in the physics regions that these are recorded from. I think we should do more things like that, right? We should take, let's say we're interested in intuitive physics, we could take relatively simple but natural scenes where there's a couple of objects in motion, and where we do have the technology right now in neurally plausible ways to detect the objects and track them, and start to push that to, okay, now how can we encode the force-based interactions in a model that is neurally mappable, and then we can go start to test those things.
So I can point out some other, you have raised some other, sort of questions and challenges, and there are a lot of other features that go beyond, sort of representations and receptive fields. These are kind of structural elements of the brain that have received attention in the past, in particular, sort of dendritic integration. When you look at the brain, you ask what are the sort of the remarkable preserved features of heterogeneity that just kind of scream have functional relevance, and clearly is sort of cellular morphology, complexity of dendritic integration. You have to think, our models, even the most complex multi-layer models, don't actually incorporate into that. So what does the brain have that these networks are missing? And I think as we kind of think about, and I like LSTMs in particular because they incorporate this notion of select state gating, and you think about input gating, that's what these complex dendritic structures are really good at doing. You have dendrites, you have nonlinear properties of different regions, and they have the ability to kind of selectively gate, suppress, but otherwise manipulate the confluence of inputs and how they affect the outputs. And so the idea of this kind of dynamic input gating is something that I would say like an LSTM is just like it's like a baby version of what the brain has already appreciated as being clearly functionally relevant. So that's something. There was a time when that was that was big, and Tommy and he did a lot of work on this kind of thinking about dendritic computation.
You mean like the stuff like with Christoph? Yeah, no.
With Christoph.
I think
that kind. There's sort of
it's kind of back a
logic
little bit,
computation. But yeah, that was
needs to be more back.
But it was really different. It was the sort of thinking there with the kind of logic.
Like what kind of computing element is a neuron? Right. I mean, it's probably much more complex than what we call a ReLU.
But even thinking about the different kinds of computation, again, like this kind of selective input gating, state-dependent input gating, that's sort of what it does.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you're touching on it whether the level of biological detail that we should implement in DeepNet, right? Because on one hand, they are too complex because they have too many parameters. On the other hand, they are too simple because they don't have all of the details that you are mentioning in. So like, how deep shall we go? Like you mentioned gating, right?
Every artificial network's got it. That's what.
So every model should be made as simple as possible, not simpler. I think that I'm fascinated. I'm a neuroscientist. I think all of these ideas are very exciting. But I think we should add those on as needed basis. I don't think we should go.
How do you know when they're
How do you know they're needed? That's
because we need concrete tasks. We need.
But I could just say my task is to do object recognition and in cellular biophysics.
Then you won't need it.
That's my task, right? I'm gonna.
If that's the task,
right? But that's just arbitrary, right?
I think that may very well be your definition of task. I think none of us are defining tasks by
What is the
exact
principle that we
architecture.
select upon which we select tasks?
I think that people have come up with a variety of different tasks that were interesting.
Navigational tasks. Put robots, and Mark's going to talk about these kind of body. Put them out in the world. Just have them, have them interact in real environments. They can be, they can even be simplified and constrained. But this is what all brains do. Whether they're cockroaches, whether they're rodents, whether they're primates, they all solve that particular problem. Now, granted, rodents won't do they might not solve the sort of occluded multi-MNIST test, but they will find their way down to the red line and make their way to wherever they need to go. I mean, they'll solve the real world navigational problem.
But Matt, you're evading the question, right? The question is, if this universe of things that I want to explain includes not just behavior, not just the input output memory, but also the things inside there. Like suppose that if I'm a molecular biologist, I might actually care about explaining second messenger systems or something like that.
I'm talking real world problems. It's like self-driving cars are solving the real world problem, and they're confronting sort of the real world challenges of sort of taking these kind of constrained solutions, trying to incorporate them into complex real world context.
You're just stipulating that that's the problem that we want to solve, and I'm asking. Not everybody agrees that that's the problem that we want to solve.
Well, that's fine. I mean, you don't have to solve that.
Everybody, but answering that question.
I'm saying if you want to know what does the brain have to offer,
You don't have to solve interesting problems.
But the brains have solved. This is the problem.
There is something I think deeply in the DNA of CBMM and a lot of BCS, but not all of BCS, is this idea that in some sense we're trying. It's part of reverse engineering the brain is to try to set as our ultimate task that we're interested in explaining. How does this machine do these incredibly amazing, complex things that no machine built by humans has ever been able to do, right? So I think that's. I'm not saying that doesn't have to be your only goal, but I think it's a good kind of maybe unstated premise to say, let's say we want to explain those kinds of things. Object recognition has been one of those, although of course been made.
But then why is Jim recording from IT? What is the point?
I think he's trying to argue with himself as much as anyone, right? He's asking himself that question. I know, because he very...
Right, but I think, so like, I like this point. I agree with Josh that this sort of, something that unifies, I think, a lot of CBM and the big chunks of BCS we are interested in behavior, not just of individuals, but also interacting individuals. But let's just say broadly behavior, right? So that is kind of a unifying force for But you're right, you could set goals at any level. I'd like to study dust. I'd like to, you can go down and sort of study things for their own sake, and we'll call that basic science. But we're kind of unified around tasks. I think I wanted to go to the next level of like, how do we make that actually a reality becomes hard, and that's why I was kind of pushing Josh a bit. And then let's do the elephant in the room here, right? Is you just say you're going to do tasks. At some point, you could call the brain back to a black box, right? You could just say, I need to just get something to explain the behavior. And if you came up with your task and you said, I need it to be, and it was a generative model that I could pull tasks all day long out of your system, I can take a fully functional, I can take a function system that will fit anything, feed it enough data, it'll essentially absorb the task, your generator, into the parameters of the model, which isn't necessarily the brain, but it will recapitulate the data and then solve the task, right? So that's why then you're like, well, we're not satisfied with that from a neuroscience perspective. I don't know if everybody's followed me so far. That would solve, and you can't just say task constraints, because you can say, well, I'd like to solve task constraints goals with some constraints from neuroscience.
Or the neuroscience
right?
is part of the task, right?
Well, no. Well, that's I'm just phrasing it differently. The tasks are still here, but there's still guideposts along the way that, hey, that internal thing doesn't look like anything we've ever seen in the brain. That model should be punished some way, right? And so that's at least that's the way I think about it. But that's bringing in some of these other things, because you could also then say, who decides what to punish? It doesn't have a Golgi reticulum, you know. So I'm going to sort of ER. I'm going to break that. So then those become arbitrary decisions.
So is it
right?
just totally sociological then?
I think. Well, I think this isn't science sort of that way. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I don't have another grounded answer for that.
Jim, you seem to be thinking, which maybe the history of recent computer vision suggests, but I don't think it's even true of computer vision, let alone the rest of AI, that. So what you were saying is like, well, if I define the task in a well enough posed way, that means it's like really general and generative.
Yeah.
Then. Which I agree is something one would want, then like you can pretty much take for granted that a deep learning approach can be designed to solve it if you're willing to wait long enough.
Right.
And I just don't think that's true with what we have today. Right? I mean, it's just empirically not true. It's not even true for things which some people, I think the general public thinks are solved, like Atari, for example, right? Like,
it becomes an efficiency game. You're right. I mean,
I'm
talking about
efficiency.
No, it's not just take a deep net, put an architecture search on it with LSTMs included, right? So you can start having memory of architecture search. You're just going to run into, like, at some point you run out of computational power.
Right now, but like I've been told that at Google, the main users of the Google Compute Cloud, DeepMind and Brain. Okay, so the most powerful computing infrastructure that our universe has ever known is currently being deployed. Like large chunks of it have been used to try to solve Atari, and even in that setting, it still hasn't succeeded, right? And what I mean by that is there's no single system. You throw out all the standard Atari games, and it learns to solve all of them at anything like human level.
Right.
Let alone the other challenges, which it has to learn as fast as humans, which is like 5 orders of magnitude faster than any of the systems which solve some of the games.
So if the race is to solve Atari as a task, you're saying that machine is not yet able to do it.
Well,
let me just dictate. What are your options now? You can let the machine keep churning, and we can all go away until it solves Atari and everything else.
It's not going to.
Computing power will continue to increase. Eventually it will, but you're going to argue it's a slow process, and there's a faster route. The faster route, you'll like this, is like we're going to inject priors into the space, and now the question is, which ones do we inject? And that's essentially Kamila's question.
I see.
Should I neuroscience kind of neuron priors, and should I put priors that are in Josh's head about how?
No, you should put the priors that are in Liz Spelke's head.
Well, okay, whatever. We're just accepting that we're going to inject different priors, and really the debate is about which priors should be injected to constrain narrow the space, the search that's already running on a task to be better defined, right?
I think that's a good way.
That's a unifying way that we all can say. Now we're back to Kamila's question: which prior should we inject on the searches that are running by Google or us or anyone?
One possibility,
if we had a task-based
bringing
defined.
which is part of the broader science to bring in, is the people who study what seem to be the inductive biases of the youngest babies. So that's why, right? Like, I mean, right now this is work, again, people, like we've been doing this with Pedro and others, and I know there's multiple, I was very, mostly pleasantly, but somewhat surprised to read several, NIPS abstracts on this topic already. Basically people saying, yeah, we're gonna look to the kinds of thing that Liz Spelke has found in even 2-month-old babies, and say, if we put those into our reinforcement learning systems, they get much better at solving Atari games much faster.
Let's just be concrete. Liz has behavioral data from kids. So you're saying I should put the behavioral data from kids in as a constraint?
No, you should put the models
you just made a leap there, right?
Well, you can't put the behavioral data
exactly. So you're injecting an additional prior now, which is through your head.
Well, I'm injecting.
No, wait, Josh. Why do you say you can't put behavioral data? The point is,
the behavioral
data acts as a constraint in the sense that the network.
What we discuss is eye looking. So it's a differences of 20 milliseconds in eye looking behavior. From there is a set of interpretations. I think that's what Jim's trying to say. So there's a difference. Right. The data is actually for how long the baby looks at this or that, and there's a difference of 20 milliseseconds here, there. That's the kind of data
not 20
that we collect.
milliseconds.
Well, sometimes it's 50 milliseconds. That's right.
It's not any
All right, let's stay focused.
It might help if you read the papers
But
before
the point is that that's not the number that you're using as a constraint. I think that's what.
Of course.
So from there,
That's what I'm trying to say.
you have some sort of story
That's
about
right.
what babies
Yeah,
are doing. That's a
that's right.
story. It's not data.
Well, it's a prior in Josh's
Wait,
case.
why is it,
But that's a
Gabriel, why is
story,
it a
right?
story?
That's not.
Why is it a story? It's
Well,
data.
no, this is
The looking time is
interpretation.
data.
It's an inference.
No.
Yeah.
But the looking data is not what
inference.
you're using as a constraint.
mean,
No,
it's
no, but
like-
you have to specify the linking assumptions. You have to say how does the whatever model you have, how does it generate?
Here, since you like physics, let me make an analogy to the history of physics. It's kind of like this. It's like as if, suppose this isn't actually, as far as I know, the history of statistical thermodynamics, but suppose it was. Suppose people at some point, back a couple hundred years ago, we're like, let's say somewhere in the early 19th century or whatever, we're trying to give some kind of like, let's say they had icing models and they had Google Compute, and so they were trying to build like Hopfield net or Boltzmann machine like models of how gases worked or something. And all sorts of people were building like, basically these Boltzmann machine like models, and they're like, well, I know there's 10 to the 26 particles in this, but we only have 10 to the 10 on our compute, but we'll do what we can. And lots of people were arguing about like how to set the potential functions. And then somebody came along, let's say, somebody like Lavoisier, or maybe even just Boyle. Somebody said, we've got these laws that we've discovered, like PV equals nRT, and maybe if you tried your things to respect these laws, they might work really well. And then somebody tried, and lo and behold, it found when they did some kind of, architecture search or gradient meta learning, they found some distribution that kind of looked a little bit exponential in this, and then, Boltzmann said, wait a second, I can write that down in this equation. Okay, so that wasn't actually the history of how it worked. It worked a little bit differently, right? It worked more like Boltzmann coming up, I don't know exactly the history, but basically I think it was like looking at the laws of chemistry and doing some Spelke-like thought experiments. Like imagine that those particles are rigid bodies and they're bouncing off of each other. And then you can derive analytically the form of that distribution from some certain basic kind of probabilistic assumptions. And then people started to say, okay, well, let's look at what we're learning about atoms and molecules, and can we like make some, So that was a research, it was more of a top-down research group.
Right. So I was saying the example of thermodynamics is a good one. And you can think of another one, and this is genetics.
Wait, can you tell us the real story of how it worked with thermodynamics?
Well, basically, thermodynamics started with quantities like temperature and pressure and heat that had no real mechanistic equivalent. It could be ethereal, could be whatever.
Right.
And then, and this was very useful, was practically useful for instance, steam engines and refining what they did. But eventually, Boltzmann and all the statistical mechanics came along, and you see that heat is really Brownian motion of particles, and you can make all the
But they were trying to
correlations.
explain the macroscopic phenomena, right?
Well, they were explaining a macroscopic phenomena with thermodynamics,
Right.
but then you had to get at a higher level of details. And this is what statistical mechanics did. Right?
But it came from the top down.
It's top down.
That was the
And
second
it's the
version.
same.
DNA
It's the
or
same
whatever.
story
Yeah.
with, if you think about, with the genetics,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, Mendel
It's
didn't
exactly-
know about
yeah.
DNA, right? The whole
Yeah, it
idea
was
of there.
Darwin first, and Mendel, and then now we have DNA and so on, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's the same story here. That's part I was trying to say with a slide in which I said the next 5 years we should go from black boxes, input-output behavior, to what is inside. And this means
But you also said Lisp programs. Which,
well, yeah.
which
because-
is good. But you could say those are like the PV equals nRT.
Yeah.
Those are
Yes.
models
But
that
what
are,
I'm saying is that they be a very important guide,
yeah.
but is not what is going on in the brain.
But can I,
somewhat.
can I ask for some clarification here? So it seems like a key difference, what we're doing and the situation that the physicists and geneticists found themselves in is that they had PV equals nRT, and everyone agreed that this is the thing that we need to explain. And they had patterns of inheritance, and everyone agreed that this is the thing that we need to explain. And we can't really agree on that, right? We have some things that we agree are important, like core object recognition, but there's lots of things that there's no standard goal there,
I
right?
don't know. I mean, I have experience with the work on the visual system of the fly. We had essentially, I think, the equivalent of a thermodynamics, if you want, which was, we have a black box, which is the fly. It gets as input position and speed of a target. this is already an idealization because, of course, the eye of the fly does not get the velocity of the position by itself. And then it outputs a torque and a lift. And then you have, the goal is to describe behavior, for instance, how to chase another fly. And you have a equation of motion that can predict, given the trajectory of the first fly, the trajectory of the second fly. And there are some probabilities because there is noise in the system and so on. Now, this is not what is going on in the brain of the fly, obviously. It starts that instead of a position and velocity, you have a pattern of excitation of photoreceptors, 3,000 ommatidia or so. So you have to compute the position and the velocity. Then you have to find out what are the neural networks or hypothetical neural networks that can do that, and so on.
You've described one thing that a fly does, right? But there's lots of things that the fly does, and if we want to build a complete model of the fly brain,
Yeah.
we have to agree on what are all the set of things that such a model needs to explain.
But if you can isolate a behavior, you're making the assumption this is a module that you can isolate. That's one way to start. I'm not saying you can always do that.
So are you trying to say that we need to have species-specific model then? Because for now what we are doing, we take AlexNet and we correlate it with everything, mice, human, monkey, and then we see how it explains the representation. But are you saying that for each of the species, we need to have a separate model with a separate set of constraints that are derived from a brain rules that are present in the specific species? Or
My
we
main
need a
message
deepness that
was
is
that,
across, generalizing
that
across the species?
we have to go from input-output models, which are important, but we have to go from there to inside the black box. And this means coupling with experiments, physiology, and with constraints we know about neurons, what they can do, what they cannot do. And there is a little bit of degrees of freedom, good scientific taste.
Yeah, but do you say that we should have a fly deepnet and then we should have a separate monkey deepnet because
No.
the principles are different in the brain?
No, I'm not saying this.
So do you think that we should have a deepnet that explains the fly brain and it will also explain the human brain? Just one model for explaining all of the species, let's say object recognition. Well, the fly doesn't have it much, but
I'm not sure what you mean one model.
because you can imagine that you have, let's say you have a human model and you have a monkey model. You build the DeepNet implementing the representations and the anatomical constraints that are in the human brain. And then you have a human DeepNet that is, for example, have the number of neurons more or less that the human brain has. And you can have another network that you implement the monkey number of neurons, and then it will be smaller, the network. And then you can have the mice network that doesn't need to have all of this topographical stuff because maybe mice doesn't have the topographical organization. So what I'm saying is that for each, if you want to do the modeling of the species, then maybe you should have, like, for every species a different model, and for every model you would have a
I don't know.
constraint
Do I
set.
need the same model for the hippocampus and the cerebellum and visual cortex? I don't understand this.
Is the basic difficulty here that just humans are just a lot more complex than flies, and flies are rather more complex than chemistry or genes.
And we don't
or
chase
single gene strains.
we don't chase female flies like male flies do.
But physics, I mean, statistical mechanics is complex in a certain sense, right? If we're talking about all the gas particles in some container, right? That's very complex, right? But the whole point was that they
Yes.
revealed
But it's
certain
easy-
physical
I mean,
laws
it's
that
easier
describe the
to-
maximum
somehow
behavior.
in physics and chemistry, maybe because they were motivated by, well, let's just say a simpler set of engineering problems. I mean, because they were really motivated by that, right? Galileo, Leonardo, you could say that the field, as you were saying, right, the field kind of converged on a clearer core set of challenges. And maybe this is why vision has made so much progress, because vision has, I mean, what you call the core object recognition challenge, you just an especially nice version of it, but it's one that the field has converged on as a thing. So I guess the basic question that maybe we're all in agreement on is what are the next such challenges?
Right, and I would just,
Yeah.
I agree with that. And I think, but to parse what Tommy said, he's like, you define the challenge
Yeah.
phase, which you're calling
Yeah.
task. Then you might describe it with input-output relationships, which
Yeah.
might be beautiful but aren't neural. And then you use the word, Tommy, then you go inside it, but you have to use good taste as to how you go inside. And that was kind of the starting point for me of the discussion, like what is good taste with respect to deep nets and core recognition was what our lab likes to think about. But I think this broader group is now kind of maybe it's like, what is the next task domain that can be
Yeah.
best
So we put out one of
formalized
these as
to
like-
redo whole game
Yeah,
again,
very good.
right?
So this
Yeah.
is like the discussion we were having.
To finish one point, sorry, about the species. We had the same phenomena as thermodynamics and statistical mechanics also with respect to chemistry, because we have classical chemistry, but we have quantum chemistry. And so we know how to describe the chemistry with the hydrogen atoms.
Quantum
You need
mechanics.
some blue, Chris, maybe some blue tape to tape Tommy in over there by the podium.
Sorry, repeating briefly, but I was saying the same, going from top to down historically, as in thermodynamics to statistical mechanics, as in Darwin to DNA, also happened in say chemistry, because at some point chemistry became explainable in terms of quantum mechanics, right? But we did not need to do the quantum mechanics in detail for every possible molecule or atom. It was enough at the beginning to do it for the hydrogen atom. And then it was clear in principle how to do it for more complex molecules, and people are doing that now. But so you don't need to do everything at the extreme level of details. We have to do it once and to be reasonably sure that we can repeat that. And hopefully we'll not have to do it for every part of the nervous system or for every species.
What would be an analogy in neuroscience where you could do it once and then?
I don't know, you do the retina with all the synapses and everything and the computation there of motion and so on.
But what is the generalizable insight that you can transfer? What is the generalizable insight that you're going to transfer to other systems?
You use the same biophysical mechanisms and learning mechanisms if needed. It's like the same quantum mechanical equation that you use for the hydrogen atom, and they just become more complicated.
But Tommy, that's like not going to explain how to build a building like this, right? I mean, that's the worry, right? I think, right, is that there's, in some sense, if you want to explain why this building up, you can explain it in terms of quantum mechanics and other basic things in physics. It just doesn't seem very useful either scientifically or from an engineering point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to make this connection to make sure that you have the right description of heat, for instance. That you have molecules and motion of them instead of some ethereal substance.
But the level of biophysics and plasticity, I mean, it's not clear in the example that you gave that is going to be generalizable, right? Like for example, we know that some synapses in the brain require dopamine to express LTP, but that's not happening in the retina. I mean, maybe a cortical microcircuit would be one candidate for that, something like that.
I must say, one surprise for me many years ago from molecular biology is that what you found in Drosophila was also important for mammals. Now it seems obvious that we share so many genes, but back in the 70s, when I was at the Max Planck Institute, this was not clear at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, that things are actually transferred from different species.
Right, so it's not clear for the neuroscience whether the same story will repeat.
Yeah.
I think that there was, again, there was sort of a period where things like, neuromorphic engineering, the idea of analog computing, and there was this notion that there are sort of fundamental principles that could be sort of derived from basic biophysics. So for instance, you can think of just the way in which neurons compute logarithms. That might actually relate to how we incorporate something like hyperbolic discounting, and that general principle might extend to the way in which we, let's say, sort of weight or scale episodic systems. That there's some principle of analog computing that applies to the way in which networks incorporate temporal information, which that principle would then across different domains, from reinforcement learning to sort of fundamental representations, let's say in specific domains, maybe the visual domain, maybe in the the spatial domain. But it would be that kind of principle. It'd be something simple. It's just this is how this is how the biophysics of analog logarithmic computing in dendrites, and that principle could then extend to everything. And we don't know what that principle is. And there was a time when there was the thought that neuromorphic engineering would give us those kinds of insight. We would incorporate the basic biophysics of cells, that they would, they would expose these basic analog principles, and then we'd get this kind of generalized property. Alan?
Yeah, I think actually, since we have 15 minutes left, anyone who wants, I think we should probably enter the question and answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something now because I have to catch a plane in a few minutes. But also as someone who mainly publishes in the computer vision area, I'd say there are tons of data sets out there with many different tasks. And ImageNet is only one, and it's object recognition maybe, but it doesn't tell you the parts of the object or many other properties that a human would like. And again, as mainly a computer vision researcher, I take it as a matter of for granted that the brain is far more complex than any deep network that we know of. And that there are challenges, and we've set up ones of ourselves, where you have 10 different tasks to do, and you try and see whether you can do them by one deep network, and nobody's managed that at all. I think the winner is UberNet by Jasnos Kokinas, which can do 4 tasks about as well as doing them individually with different trained deep networks. So I couldn't, it's sort of hard for me really to believe that there is a single deep network that does the human ventral stream. At least if it is, it's far cleverer than any deep network that anyone's come up with yet. And if we're just object recognition, again, it's object recognition of certain types of objects. If you want to find a human in an image, you're not going to take the deep network that you use on ImageNet and expect it to do it. It's not going to do very well. It's going to do fairly badly. So, in computer vision, it's rather more a pragmatic method of using these things as tools and realizing that the final model you're going to end up with, at least from the computer vision perspective, is going to be so much more complex than anything that we've got now. And if you think, as an ex-physicist, if you think of the difference between physics and statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, types of subjects, why don't you think of behavioral tasks? If you could figure out what humans can see, like the types of things that Shimon Ullman's group has been doing, the minimal images or things of that sort, then you could have ideas of what types of tasks you ought to be trying to solve, and then the neuroscience could perhaps come in and tell you what you're going to be doing. But otherwise, I see models being tested, which, although surely they're better at predicting responsive neurons than anything that's out there at the moment, but still they're a long way away from being able to do it, to do it properly. Then you've got to also look at the ease at which you can do adversarial attacks on any deep network. Admittedly, that's a moving target because, I have one student, one paper was an attack, the next paper was defense, the next paper was an attack. But nevertheless, this is only by adding in, tiny amounts of noise on the image. And if you take that into a far greater range of tasks by changing the context, scaling the object down, changing the lighting, changing the material properties, you can break anything trained on ImageNet within a fraction of a second. It's not that hard.
So are you saying that basically we need, first of all, like multitasking of the deepnet that more complex?
You may do that. I personally don't believe that the current architecture, even if you manage to get it to do multitasking,
maybe that would be our goal.
Would be adequate. I think you need far more sophisticated neural architectures, of which the current things, they're good, but they're a long way away from. We'd like to have things like ideal, cortical circuits that people talk about, but those have got to be far more sophisticated, I would guess, than current deep network components. I'm speaking here partly as a pragmatist. I like to try and build deep, sophisticated models, but to get them published in communication conferences, they have to work well on hard benchmark data sets. And if they don't, I can't get them published. And so that gives one a measure of humility and also one of realizing quite how far away we are, even with the most advanced deep networks, despite all the New York Times columnists and things like that, how far away we are from having systems that really work at all.
Yeah, I think one thing that you notice is that the benchmark for you is the performance on some like artificial intelligence task, like for example ImageNet, right? But like if we want to explain the brain and behavior, we may not need the performance that is super high on this.
But I mean, the performance on ImageNet is not actually that good, to be honest.
I mean, humans can do better than that. I mean, there's been a few experiments where they tried, and I think, reporting that humans do worse than deep nets. And I think there was one student, and the other one gave up. And you can easily do more controlled experiments on find that the errors that humans make are simply because, okay, maybe they don't know all the variety of dogs or plants that happen to be in ImageNet, or they have linguistic errors and they output, a name which isn't the name that's down there. So I think the performance there is really overhyped. Take in all these other things, background, putting in occlusion. We've done studies. We had a paper called Object Recognition with and Without Objects. So, okay, you take ImageNet, you take out the object, you try and predict it from the background. Now, you don't really do that well, but you do far better than you should do. Because frankly, you can put an object anywhere and people are going to recognize it, provided it's big enough. You can occlude it in many ways and people are going to recognize it. But you could easily break deep networks covered once by occlusion. So I would really say that I strongly believe in hierarchies and things of that sort, but I don't think we're pragmatically anywhere near having the hierarchies that are good enough to do the types of tasks that a normal human could do just looking at everyday images.
Yeah, I feel like this is kind of part of the discussion that we know that the deep nets are good, as a starting point, right? But we just want to introduce some of the constraints in the deep net to make them better. And what we were trying to discuss is what would be this constraint? Does it matter to introduce a constraint from the brain, or we should just concentrate on learning or just design better tasks? What basically is the improvement? Because we know that we have to improve it, they are not good, but what is the direction of the improvement that we should
Well, I would
do?
say if you want a thermodynamics stat-phys model, one strategy is just to see what humans can do and see how well you can break the deep networks, or what types of models would be, could not be broken. That would be one thing. That would be the thermodynamics. For the statistical physics would be understanding the neuroscience. And, it seems to me in the short term that's a far harder thing to do, but it does seem in the longer term that's where you're going to get the major payoff. Maybe there are some magical, wonderful circuits in there. Maybe the clearly properties that the brain has which are far better than anything we've got. Just take the energy requirements. What is it? A computer GPUs, 1,500 watts. Human brain is 20 watts. Most of that's keeping you alive. So the amount of computations down to 1 watt or 2 watts. The amount of resources that the deep networks are doing in terms of power is just completely disproportionate to how well they behave compared to humans.
So trying to understand, I completely agree with that. But so would you suggest trying to understand, maybe this is a reason to look at the details of neurons. I don't know about the endoplasmic reticulum, but the metabolic, the stuff that couples the power circuitry, right? That couples metabolism to spiking or something. Is that where we should be looking? Maybe
because that's something.
think it's a hint.
Does
that
far
could be
better
another
than any
constraint.
More a hint
I
than
agree.
missing
It's
something.
amazing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people are saying they want 1,000. You said 4 GPUs. These days people want 1,000 GPUs.
Right, exactly.
I mean, you can make
No,
an
no,
argument
I-
if you want to
I-
do AI that matters. You should be all AI researchers should be given 1 watt. Then they'll not only solve intelligence,
1
but
watt
save the environment.
Challenge.
Well,
Well, it's just simple.
Yeah.
It's like
Seriously.
Look, computing a derivative. You take a computer, standard derivative. It's going to, run an algorithm that will compute a derivative using 100 watts maybe, or you just have one transistor will do with a micro. An analog computer can compute certain things that a digital computer will take 6 orders of magnitude more, simply because.
It may not be analog versus digital. Though.
No, I'm just saying that's the kind of
example.
clue.
We're not
It's
analog
saying-
computers either.
It may
We are
be
most certainly analog
sparse
computers.
spiking.
That's what I'm
Spiking
saying.
is analog?
Oh, you're missing the spiking is not. Spiking is a
We
means
can
of
debate about this,
communication,
but
but that's
we're
not
just-
the nature of computation in the brain. That's what I'm saying. That's the thing that we're missing. Brain dynamics, dendritic computation, the fundamental analog nature of cellular integration. We're missing all of that. And you can say, well, one clue is that if you incorporate that kind of computation, you go from megawatts to microwatts. Basically, it's just a clue that there is a lot of analog computation. in the brain.
I certainly agree that the number one
May
reason
not
why
need it,
engineers should study the brain is for that.
But I think it also depends, would you agree that the constraint that we would care about, for example, the energy constraint, it's really dependent on the task that we are trying to explain? Because trying to explain core object recognition, there may be a different set of constraints that we need, and some of them may be brain-inspired. But if we go to more like extent understanding that is over longer timescales, then we may need to integrate other constraints to really develop that. If you go even further, if you want to understand learning, and this is your benchmark, and learning in adult life is on a relatively shorter timescale, there may be different constraints. But if you want to understand learning from the development, then you need to rethink the learning route completely that you are having in your model. So I feel that it really depends on the task, what constraints you need in your model at the end of the day.
I agree. I think there are lots of different, there are different sorts of problems. Again, given the sort of the heterogeneity of both sort of brain structure, biophysics, it suggests there are different problems that benefit from, different aspects of these computational solutions the brain has figured out, but which we haven't. That's Tommy's black box point. We just have one box. The brain has many boxes.
I think we should.
Are there questions?
I had a question about when to declare victory in a given task. So I saw Matt Botwinick give a talk like a few weeks ago at Harvard, and they have this like meta learning thing. It's the deepest of deep nets, right? It's a recurrent net. So they basically say, oh, that thing does learning to learn. Humans do learning to learn. Therefore, this is the same, right?
Well,
whereas,
say a little bit more than that,
but whereas I spend like days and days trying to fit these different models on individual participants' behavior, trying to predict their behavior out of sample, trying to find some mechanistic explanation of what might be going on. Do you think it might make sense to compare even these things on these different levels? Should I run a recurrent network and see if this makes good out of sample predictions for what people do, or does this even make sense? Is this not like a different level in mass levels? I just don't. It's more like a practical.
You're asking how to test Matt's models as cognitive models?
Yeah, does that even make sense?
Sure, possibly. Possibly.
I think there's the major pitfall with all of these things is that you have to pre-train them if you ever want to compare them with humans. And whereas other kinds of models that we build, you don't have to pre-train them because in some sense the pre-training is already kind of compiled into the design model.
Do you think it would make sense to compare them? Because
at what starting point, right? You can't just throw them into the task and you have to pre-train them, right? Otherwise, it's not a.
In a way, if it does what humans do, then you just have to find out what does this thing now do, right? So then I have to have maybe like.
But that's not the claim.
20 years you will have, instead of psychology departments, you will have deep net departments. So.
but that's not the claim. Their claim is that humans have all this pre-experimental experience plus all of evolution. Yeah. That's the starting point. And so to the extent that you can compare these to each other, you have to have some account of that.
But I would say to the extent that someone like Matt or whoever wants to advertise a model as it's doing brain things, it's not fair for them to do that. That's the brain stamp of approval version. If it doesn't do it out of the box, then it shouldn't be said that way. Now, you're right, it's probably need that stuff, but that's his job.
Wait, I'm confused because you're training your models on
I know.
image
data. Okay, so all we're saying is by the time they get to their end state is this competitive, and we say how competitive. We don't say it solves the problem, how competitive it is with how brain-like it is. And we're actually quantifying that and scoring all that. So if someone like Matt or anybody wants to say this is brain-like, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. We them do that unless they actually compare it on benchmarks that we are setting.
That is.
And you might say, well, then it should be trained, but it should be his job to train it, not necessarily his, because the one who claimed it was brain-like is the one who should put the work in, and that might be you. But if Matt wants to take that mantle from us, then he needs to do it.
In fairness to Matt, he did. They are at least trying to do that.
Well, I know they're trying to do it, but I'm just saying that is kind of a meta point that we should be protecting in sense what the judgment of is this brain like that. That's in some sense our most important job, at least on the experimental side, is to actually execute on that. Otherwise, people say everything's brain like.
But I thought that we all just agreed that there's a sociological component.
For deep mind and everybody else who's like, we got AI and there's a brain thing and brain stamp of approval, right? But actually, we want to actually build models that are competitive on those things, and that's our goal. And so we need to hold up those high standards on task, neuron fit, everything.
But what about the aspect of taste in sociology, right? I think we already ran into that we couldn't agree on what aspects of the brain are important to be captured by things, and then we can't hit people with that cudgel.
Some of us better start just posting up those things that like these are the things that you need. These are the challenges you got to solve if you want to actually say you're.
But not all right. So is endoplasmic reticulum in or out?
You can put it on. I'm not going to put it on. Tommy said good. everybody pick their taste and let's start doing it.
But then we
right?
can't be arbiters of that, right? I can't go up to
Yeah,
Matt
that's our
Bobinick
job.
and say,
we
sorry.
are the arbiters
Yeah.
of that. Who else is the arbiter of that?
All right, well,
So this question is directed mainly to Nancy and Gabriel. In the beginning, Nancy, you said that, well, if the model is a baby, that's not a model. One question there is that when we finally build this model of the brain, would it not look like a baby? The only difference will be that it won't be a black box because we know the computations inside it. So is a model that is as complicated as the model of what is running in a baby's head not an acceptable model? That's the first question that I have. Complicated, hopefully. We might have to develop language to sort of accommodate the complications to talk in public, but it won't be like a 2-parameter contrast or spatial frequency kind of model.
Yeah, my objection was not that that would be too complicated. Maybe it has to be that complicated. I don't know. My objection just was that wouldn't get us anywhere. That wouldn't explain anything.
But
right?
if you have a model that is as complicated as the baby and explains every neuron in the brain on every task, that seems satisfactory, right? Maybe it's not. But what other understanding do we even demand for is probably my question. The other thing, I think Gabriel said that we always aspire for aspire for the simplest. Do you think that we only aspire for the simplest model to inject better priors into this system so that we can finally get the very complex model? Is that a fair?
I guess what I was trying to allude to in that case is that for any task, I think we should try the battery of tools that we have now and see how far we can push them before we invoke mysterious agents doing fancy things. And then to the extent that we fail, then that means that we need to add to those models. The previous question, I think, is a very interesting one. Many of us have had different discussions along what does it mean to understand computational models. Jim had a very lucid discussion about this in the summer school, I believe, or maybe it was some other instantiation of that. To me, if we can define mathematically what the principles are, that's understanding, and then that's debatable. We've had a disagreement, maybe with Tommy as well, about this. But if we have models that can predict behavior, then that they can predict neural responses, I would be extremely happy if in my lifetime we can achieve that for a series of problems. The level of trying to explain that in English terms or that I don't think that's a necessary requirement, and some people disagree about interpretability.
So understanding how tides work, it's enough to have a tide table. Like here it is, the date, the time, comes up and comes down, that's it. That's the whole understanding of tides.
To the extent that you
I
can
find that
actually make
unsatisfying.
predictions.
Yes, we could totally predict the tides. Totally unsatisfying. Because there's a deep principle that table is based on. So the hope is that there be something more than just ability to predict data.
Yeah.
But that there be some principles we could extract that
I
would
feel like
an
we've had a bunch of
understanding.
these discussions where
Yeah,
we
we
wind
do
up in
this
like
all the
amateur
time.
philosophy of science. No, we should bring in some professionals. No, I mean, and you know, this is again something that especially philosophers of science and some philosophically inclined cognitive scientists like Tanya Lombroso have studied extensively. Right. Yeah. I mean, and there's things which we all recognize when we say them, right? Like you don't want to just to describe the data you have, but you want to be able to do new experiments. But another is a kind of counterfactual part to it, like the idea that, and this is relative, but I think we all recognize this, that a good explanation should say things like, not just have something which fits here, but explain why we're using this model and not those. Right, like have some sense of what the space of, like the meta space of what are possible alternative models, and why this one is actually working and not
there will be only
those.
one unique solution, probably. Like
there may not be. No, that's part of a good explanation. It might be, you know, we might say this model works, but as far as I understand, the reason why it works is maybe these sorts of things here, which would open up a whole other spaces of models which would work too, right? And then that's a prediction, and then you go and test those, and then you feel like you've understood something. For like one way I've come to understand something a lot in our lab's work is we build a model that works, and then we think we understand why. We think it's this thing, so then we say, okay, well, we break the. You say, well, can we build a model that just does that? And then, oh, that one works just as well. Or sometimes we think we think we're doing a lesion. We're trying to show this. It wasn't this, but then that model works just as well. So in some of our NIPS papers, that happened too, and we learned something. So it's I mean, again, I think this is where Jim and I think we mostly agree on most things in practice. Is like you really have to explore spaces of models that vary in all sorts of qualitative as well as quantitative features. There's a sort of large architecture process which we're all involved in, and it'd be nice to get computational tools which could automate a lot more of that. So we didn't have to use like, you know, there's this term graduate student descent, but we could also have like, I don't know, graduate student to Darwinism. survival or natural selection random variation of students' thesis
I don't know
projects
where
is
that's
painful,
going.
almost as painful for the advisor as for the student.
So I think we're actually out of time. So can we thank our speakers again? Or